I never thought it would happen to me. My life was typical. I was just another teenage girl trying to make sense of her life, trying to fit in at school and deal with the changes at home. My mom had remarried a man named Robert, and at first, I thought it would be just like any other blended family situation, awkward at first, but it would eventually work out. However, I quickly realized that things between us, Robert and me, were different, and I didn't know how to handle it. Robert was 45, my mother's age, and he worked as a lawyer. He had his own life, his own career, and his own set of rules. He was strict, sometimes distant, but there was always a sense of control about him that I couldn't ignore. When he moved in, I was still adjusting to my new life. We'd moved from a small town to the city, and it felt like everything around me was changing at a pace I couldn't keep up with. My friends were far away, my mom was busy, and I felt more alone than ever. At first, Robert was distant, but he was always there, always around the house. He was my mom's husband, and she was happy, but something about him made me uncomfortable. He wasn't the warm, approachable type of guy. He wasn't the type of stepdad you would go to for advice or comfort. No, Robert was someone who kept his distance, someone who only interacted with me when it was necessary. I never thought about it much. I just accepted it as a part of life. But soon, I began to notice small things, uncomfortable things, things that I couldn't explain. One evening, after dinner, I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself from the fact that I was still living in a place that didn't feel like home. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to forget the weird tension that had been building between Robert and me. I didn't know why, but it felt like something was different every time he looked at me, something I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't anything obvious, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. It was a quiet night. My mom had gone out with some friends, leaving me alone with Robert. I had no intention of talking to him. I didn't want to. It had been that way for months. Robert and I didn't have a reason to speak to each other beyond basic pleasantries. But that night, he walked into the living room and stopped in front of me, watching me for a moment. "Hey," he said, his voice low but firm. "What's going on with you? You've been quiet lately." I didn't look up from my phone. "Just tired," I muttered, not sure if I wanted to engage. "You should get out more," he said, stepping closer to the couch. "You're always cooped up in here. There's more to life than your phone." I rolled my eyes, but I could feel his eyes on me, a little too intense for comfort. I wasn't used to Robert talking to me like this. It was always my mom who handled the emotional stuff, while Robert stayed distant, almost cold. "I'm fine," I said quickly, trying to push him away, but he didn't move. Instead, he sat down on the edge of the couch next to me, too close for my liking. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if it was the closeness or the way he was acting that made me feel uncomfortable, but I couldn't shake the feeling. "You know, I'm here if you need someone to talk to," he said. "I know it can't be easy living in a new place, especially with everything that's changed." I glanced up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time that night. There was something in his eyes, a softness, maybe even concern, but also something else. Something that made my skin prickle. I wasn't sure if it was just me overthinking, but it felt like there was a deeper meaning in his words. I quickly looked away. "I'm fine," I repeated, standing up to walk away. "Thanks." I went to my room, trying to shake off the feeling of his presence lingering in the living room. I knew I was probably just imagining things, but that didn't stop the unease from creeping into my thoughts. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to get comfortable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his eyes watching me like he knew something I didn't. The next day, I decided I needed to get out of the house. I needed to escape the weird tension, even if just for a little while. I told my mom I was going to the park, and she barely looked up from her work. I wasn't sure if she noticed anything different between me and Robert, but I didn't feel like I could talk to her about it. That night, I went back to the living room to watch TV, hoping for some distraction. My mom had gone to bed early, and I thought Robert was still working in his office. But when I walked into the living room, I saw him standing by the window, staring outside. It felt strange, like I was intruding. "I didn't mean to interrupt," I said quietly, but Robert turned around before I could leave. "No, you're fine," he said, his tone softer than usual. "I was just thinking." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. But he didn't leave the room. Instead, he stood there, looking at me in a way I couldn't quite place. It made my heart race, and I suddenly felt very self-conscious. For the next few moments, neither of us spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It was just different, and I didn't know how to respond. Then, Robert spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost like he was talking to himself. "You know, we could do something tomorrow." Just the two of us. Maybe go for a walk or something. I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't an offer I had expected, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Robert and I had never really spent time together alone before, and the thought of it made my stomach twist. "I'll think about it," I said, unsure of what to say next. That night, I went to bed feeling more confused than ever. I didn't know what to think about Robert or his sudden interest in me. Was it just an attempt to bond? Or was it something more? I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, but they lingered. The next morning, I found myself avoiding Robert, just like I always did. I wasn't sure what had happened the night before. It wasn't that I hadn't appreciated his offer. He was just trying to be nice, I assumed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to shift. I'd spent the entire morning in my room, scrolling through my phone and pretending to do my homework. Anything to avoid the awkwardness of running into him again. By the time lunch rolled around, I decided to go outside for a walk. I didn't want to be cooped up in the house any longer. The weather was clear and cold, perfect for a stroll. I slipped on my jacket and headed out the door, not really thinking about where I was going. I just needed some fresh air, some space. As I walked, I kept thinking about what Robert had said the night before. Just the two of us. It wasn't the words themselves that bothered me, but the fact that it had felt different. He didn't usually make an effort to spend time with me, and the way he said it, like it was something casual, something he did all the time, only made me more uncertain. I walked for almost an hour before I turned back toward the house. The walk had been enough to clear my head, at least a little. I figured I could go back to my room, ignore everything, and just wait for this odd phase to pass. But when I got back to the house, I saw Robert standing by the front door, holding 2 mugs of coffee. I wasn't sure if it was the way he was looking at me or just the weird atmosphere between us, but I immediately felt a wave of discomfort. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He simply handed me a mug, his eyes holding mine for a second longer than necessary. "Thought you might want some coffee," he said, his voice low and calm. "Thanks," I replied, accepting the mug, trying not to notice the way his hand brushed against mine when I took it. It wasn't much, but it felt too intimate, too close. We stood there in silence, sipping our coffee, neither of us really knowing what to say. The air felt thick, charged with an awkwardness I couldn't explain. After a few minutes, Robert cleared his throat. "You know," he said, his voice quieter, "I've been thinking. We've been living together for a while now, and I don't want you to feel like you have to avoid me." I froze. Was that what I had been doing? Avoiding him? I hadn't realized how obvious it must have been. "I don't avoid you," I said quickly, my voice defensive. "It's just, I don't know what you expect from me. We don't have a lot in common." Robert smiled, but it wasn't the usual smile. It was softer, almost like he understood. "You don't have to have things in common to talk. I just want you to feel comfortable here. It's not always easy, I know, but we're family now, and I want you to feel like you can talk to me if you need to." His words lingered in the air, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he was being genuine. Maybe it was just me, but the way he looked at me, it wasn't just like a stepdad trying to bond with his stepdaughter. It felt different. "Okay," I said, feeling like my voice was barely a whisper. "I'll try." The conversation was short, and I felt like I was still trying to figure out if I could trust him. But something about his expression, his willingness to talk, left me confused. For the first time, I felt like maybe there was something more to him, more than I had been willing to see. The next few days passed in a blur. I started to see Robert in a different light, but I wasn't sure how to handle it. Every time I ran into him, there was a sense of familiarity between us that hadn't been there before. We started talking more, though it was still mostly about everyday things. His patience with me was clear. He didn't push, he didn't try to force me into anything. But there were moments, small moments, like when I'd walk into the kitchen and find him there, and for a few seconds, either of us would say anything. Just the quiet and the tension that seemed to hang between us. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a book, when Robert came in. He sat down across from me, not saying anything at first. We were alone, and I couldn't help but notice how different things had become. "How's your day?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Fine," I answered, not looking up. "Busy with schoolwork." Robert leaned forward slightly, his eyes watching me closely. "It's important to take breaks, you know. Don't overwork yourself." I smiled, but I felt uneasy. The way he was looking at me, like he was trying to be more than just the stepdad, was starting to mess with my head. "I'll be fine," I said quickly, standing up to leave the room. But before I could walk away, Robert spoke again. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just don't want you to feel alone here. You're part of this family now, and I want to be someone you can rely on." I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to walk out of the room, to pretend like everything was normal again. But there was another part of me, the part that was growing more confused by the day, that wanted to stay, to talk, to explore what this new dynamic was becoming. But I couldn't. Not yet. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll talk to you later." As I walked out of the room, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. Something had changed between us, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. The days following our conversation felt strangely different. I couldn't quite place my finger on it, but something had shifted. Robert and I didn't talk much at first, but when we did, the air seemed heavier. There were moments when he'd look at me, and it felt like he was seeing me in a way he hadn't before. I wasn't sure if I was overthinking it, but there was a tension between us that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't anything overt, but the way he moved, the way he spoke, made me feel like something was quietly changing. It wasn't that he was doing anything inappropriate or crossing any clear boundaries, but the small things, the way his eyes lingered on mine when we spoke, the way he'd smile just a little too long, made me uncomfortable in a way I didn't understand. I tried to push the thoughts aside, telling myself that he was just trying to be a good stepdad. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. One afternoon, a week later, my mom was at work, and I found myself alone at home again. I was supposed to be studying, but my thoughts kept wandering back to Robert. Every time I tried to focus, my mind would drift back to the way he'd looked at me during our conversation in the living room, the way he'd talked to me differently than before. I heard footsteps in the hallway and immediately straightened up, trying to act normal. It was Robert again. He knocked on my door lightly before opening it, his expression soft but unreadable. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "How's your day been?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "It's fine, just working on some stuff for school." Robert nodded, stepping into the room. "Mind if I sit for a bit?" I motioned toward the chair by the desk, though I wasn't sure if I wanted him to sit down or not. Something about being alone with him still made me uneasy, and I didn't know why. I didn't know if I was just being paranoid or if there was really something happening between us that I couldn't ignore. He sat down without waiting for me to say anything more. "You know, I remember being in your shoes," Robert said, his tone thoughtful. "New place, new people, it can be overwhelming, but it gets easier." I nodded, trying not to let my discomfort show. "Yeah, I guess." He looked at me, his eyes steady. "If you ever want to talk about it, about anything really, you don't have to keep it to yourself." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, the stress of fitting in, the feeling of being so out of place. But another part of me didn't want to open up to him. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he was my stepdad. Maybe it was because I wasn't sure how much I could trust him. Maybe it was both. I forced a smile and looked away. "Thanks, but I'm okay." Robert didn't push, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. He studied me for a moment, then sighed softly. "All right," he said. "Just know I'm here if you need anything." I nodded, trying to change the subject. "Do you need help with anything?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" I shrugged. "I don't know. You're always doing things around the house. You can probably use a break, right?" He chuckled lightly. "Maybe, but I'm all right for now. Just remember, you don't have to do everything on your own either." There it was again, the subtle way he always seemed to want to take care of things for me. His words weren't exactly inappropriate, but the way he said them, the care in his voice, made me feel like there was something more beneath the surface. "All right," I said, feeling awkward again. "Thanks." Robert stood up, looking at me one last time before walking toward the door. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice almost hesitant. "Yeah," I said, forcing another smile. "I'm fine." As he closed the door behind him, I sat back in my chair, the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just being nice. But something about the way he interacted with me made me feel like I was the one overanalyzing everything. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from feeling unsettled. The days after our conversation didn't feel like they were the same. There was a quiet tension in the house that I couldn't shake. Robert and I didn't talk much, but when we did, there was something different about it. The way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke, everything felt charged, even if it wasn't obvious. I couldn't tell if it was all in my head or if he was actually changing the way he interacted with me. One evening, a few days later, I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to focus on some homework, when Robert walked in. He was carrying a box of firewood and set it down on the counter with a quiet grunt. His presence was familiar, but now it made me feel something I couldn't quite explain. I noticed the way his shirt clung to his chest, the way his hands moved, like everything about him was so much more noticeable. I quickly looked back at my homework, trying not to dwell on it. "Need help with anything?" he asked, his voice low and easy. There was no hint of discomfort, no awkwardness. He was just being himself. I shook my head. "No, I'm fine. Just trying to get through some of this stuff." He nodded, setting the firewood down and wiping his hands on his pants. "All right, but if you ever want to take a break, we can go out for a walk or something." "A walk? With Robert?" I wasn't sure how to respond to that. It wasn't that I didn't like the idea. It was just that every time we did something together now, it felt different. More intimate somehow, like there was a quiet understanding between us that didn't quite make sense. "I think I'll just finish this up," I said quickly, hoping my voice didn't sound too strained. "Thanks, though." Robert didn't push. He just smiled, but it wasn't the usual polite smile he used when we interacted. It was softer, almost thoughtful. "All right. Just remember, you're not alone here," he said before walking out of the kitchen. I sat there for a while, staring at my homework without really seeing it. I didn't know what was happening between us, but I couldn't deny that it was becoming harder to ignore. My thoughts kept circling back to that moment when he'd looked at me like he really cared, like he wanted to be there for me in a way that went beyond the typical stepdad role. I didn't know how to handle it, but I knew that something was changing, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. The following days passed with a strange quietness. Robert and I started spending more time together, though it was mostly casual. We'd go on walks, share meals, and sometimes talk about nothing at all. It wasn't anything overtly significant, but the way he made me feel when we were together was starting to shift. I began to look forward to the moments when we would talk, even though I was still trying to figure out how I felt about him. One afternoon, we decided to go for a hike in the nearby woods. My mom was busy with work, and it was just the two of us. It was a simple thing, really, just a walk through the woods, but it felt different with Robert. I couldn't pinpoint why, but as we walked side by side, the tension between us seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was definitely there. We reached a clearing by the edge of a small lake, and Robert stopped to catch his breath. I stood beside him, feeling the cool breeze against my skin, but my mind was elsewhere. The air was heavy with unspoken words. We hadn't talked much during the hike, but now that we were standing still, it felt like everything needed to be said. "How are you doing?" Robert asked, his voice quieter than usual. I wasn't sure how to answer. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk, it was just that I didn't know how to explain the turmoil inside me. I hadn't been prepared for any of this. I hadn't been prepared for him to start caring, for me to start caring back. "I'm okay," I said finally, my voice more uncertain than I intended. "Just trying to get used to everything." Robert nodded, his gaze focused on the lake in front of us. "I know it's been hard, but you're doing great. You're stronger than you think." I looked at him, feeling a knot form in my stomach. It wasn't just the words he said, it was the way he said them, like he really understood me, like he really cared about me. I wasn't used to feeling like this. I wasn't used to someone paying attention to me the way Robert had been, and that scared me. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but nothing seemed right. The more time I spent with him, the more I realized that I was starting to look at him in a way that wasn't just familial. I wasn't sure when it had happened, but my feelings for him were no longer just those of a stepdaughter, and that realization was making everything more complicated than I was ready to handle. Robert turned to look at me then, his expression serious. "You know you can talk to me, right? I'm not here just because I'm your mom's husband. I care about you." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. His words lingered between us, and I didn't know what to say. "I know," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper, "but I don't know what I'm feeling anymore." Robert studied me for a moment, his eyes softening, and for the first time, I saw him as more than just the man who married my mom. In that moment, he was just Robert, someone who had become a part of my life in a way I couldn't explain. But even as the words hovered on the edge of my lips, I couldn't bring myself to say them. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't ready for it to stop. The days passed in a strange blur. I couldn't get that moment by the lake out of my mind. Robert's words, the way he looked at me, the weight of the unspoken connection between us, it was all starting to unravel in my mind. It was confusing. I had never expected to feel this way. He was my stepdad, and I should have seen him as nothing more than that. But every time we spent time together, every time he spoke to me, it felt like I was falling into something I couldn't control. The house was quiet most of the time now. My mom was busy with work again, and Robert, even though he was home, kept to himself. But there were moments, small moments, when our paths would cross, and I felt the same uneasy tension from before. Each time, it grew stronger, harder to ignore. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen, finishing some homework, when Robert walked in. It wasn't unusual for him to come in while I was working, but today, something felt different. He looked at me for a moment before walking over to the counter, standing a little too close. "Need any help with that?" he asked casually, his voice smooth, but I could hear the slight tension in it. I looked up at him, surprised. No, I'm good," I said quickly, trying to focus on the paper in front of me. But Robert didn't move. Instead, he lingered by the counter, watching me in a way that made my stomach flutter. His gaze was intense, and I couldn't help but feel like he was looking at me in a way I wasn't used to. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard. The silence stretched between us, and it felt like the world was closing in on me. "I've noticed you've been keeping to yourself a lot lately," Robert said softly, his voice quieter than usual. "I just want to make sure you're okay." I froze. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to admit that I was feeling lost, confused, and overwhelmed. I didn't want to talk about how he had started to affect me in ways I couldn't explain. "I'm fine," I said, my voice more firmly than I intended, trying to shut down the conversation. "I just have a lot of work to do." Robert's eyes didn't leave mine. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here," he said quietly, his words almost like a promise. I nodded quickly, turning my attention back to my homework, hoping he would leave me alone. But he didn't. He stayed there for a moment longer, his presence making it hard to concentrate. Finally, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. Later that evening, after dinner, Robert suggested we go for a walk. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't want to spend more time with him than necessary, but something inside me told me that it would be better than sitting around, avoiding him. So, I agreed, even though I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into. We stepped outside into the cool evening air, walking side by side down the quiet street. It was peaceful, the only sounds coming from the crunch of the gravel under our feet and the soft hum of the wind. I tried to keep the conversation light, talking about trivial things, school, the weather, anything to avoid the underlying tension that I could feel between us. But Robert didn't seem interested in small talk. Instead, he turned to me after a few minutes of walking in silence, his expression serious. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked again, his voice low. "I know we haven't always gotten along, but I want to make sure you feel comfortable here. You matter to me." His words hit me harder than I expected. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until he said it. The way he looked at me, the sincerity in his voice, it was different. But it wasn't just concern. It felt like something more. Something deeper. "I don't know what to think anymore," I admitted quietly, not looking at him. "Things have changed, and I don't know how to handle it." Robert stopped walking, standing beside me. "I know. I feel it too. But we can't keep ignoring it. Whatever this is between us, we need to figure it out." I turned to face him, and for the first time, I didn't look away. His eyes were so steady, so focused on me. And for a moment, I forgot about the lines I had drawn between us. I forgot about everything except the way I felt standing there, so close to him. The moment hung in the air, and I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't undo. And just as I was about to speak, I heard a car approaching in the distance. The sound of it broke the silence between us, and Robert turned away, his shoulders tense. "We should go back," he said softly, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. My thoughts were too tangled. I couldn't figure out what was happening. All I knew was that something had changed between us, and I wasn't sure if I could stop it anymore. The days after our walk felt like they were stretching out, each one heavier than the last. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The way Robert had looked at me, the things he had said. It felt like the walls between us were starting to crumble, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just two people having a moment of honesty, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. And I couldn't ignore it anymore. I spent the next few days trying to avoid Robert as much as I could. I'd lock myself in my room or stay out for longer than I needed to, but no matter how much I tried to distance myself, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened between us. Every time I saw him, it was like the air shifted. It wasn't just the casual glances or the awkward silences, it was something deeper, and I didn't know how to handle it. One evening, after dinner, Robert approached me in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. My mind kept drifting back to that moment on our walk, to the way he had spoken to me. I didn't hear him approach until he was standing right in front of me. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. I hesitated. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to face this, but I knew that avoiding him wasn't going to make it go away. I had to address it, whatever it was. "Sure," I said quietly, setting the magazine down and looking up at him. Robert sat down beside me, his body close but not touching. It was almost as if he was waiting for me to say something, anything, but I couldn't. The silence between us was deafening, and I could feel the tension building again. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice calm but with an edge to it, "about everything that's happened between us. And I want to be clear with you. I never wanted to make you feel uncomfortable or confused." I looked at him, my chest tightening. "Then why did it feel so different?" I asked before I could stop myself. My voice wavered, and I could hear the uncertainty in it. "Why do I feel like something is changing?" Robert met my gaze, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. His eyes were soft, but there was a sadness in them that made my heart ache. "It's because something has changed," he said quietly. "I can't pretend anymore. I don't know what to call it, and I don't know what happens next. But I do know that I care about you more than I should." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, I felt my stomach drop. I had been afraid to hear them, and now that they were out in the open, it felt like everything was spinning out of control. "I don't know what this is," Robert continued, his voice low and steady. "I don't know what it means, but I don't want to pretend that we can just ignore it anymore. And I don't want to hurt you." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. The words I had been avoiding, the feelings I had been trying to push down, were now laid bare. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. "I don't want to hurt you either," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I don't know what this is. I don't know what we're doing." Robert sighed, his expression one of conflict. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I can't keep pretending like nothing's happening between us. You deserve to know how I feel." I stared at him, unable to tear my eyes away. The room felt small, the air thick with unsaid words. We were standing on the edge of something, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step, to face whatever this was between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the tension between us so thick I could barely breathe. I wanted to say something, to tell him how I felt, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I stood up quickly, breaking the silence. "I need some time to think," I said, my voice shaky. I can't deal with this right now." Robert didn't try to stop me. He just nodded, his eyes dark with what I could only guess was regret. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. I turned and walked out of the room, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't process everything that had just happened. The confession, the way everything had changed between us, none of it made sense, and I didn't know how to handle it. That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What did it mean that Robert had said he cared about me? What did it mean that I didn't know how to feel about it? I didn't want to think about the possibility of crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, but I also couldn't stop myself from thinking about it. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure: nothing between Robert and me would ever be the same again.